Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our ITS seminar, remote version. It is my great pleasure to present Professor Ryan Wang. Ryan is an assistant professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Northeastern University. And he's also Associate Director of the Research on Social Media at the Boston Area Research Initiative, BARI. If you haven't seen it, I recommend that you have a look on that. It is an initiative between Harvard and Northeastern. His work is on the interplay between data science and computational social science. His research focuses on two interrelated areas: human mobility, perturbation under the influence of natural and man-made disasters like epidemics, and mobility equality in large cities. Before joining Northeastern, Ryan was a postdoc fellow at the Department of Sociology at Harvard University. He received his PhD degree from the Department of Civil Engineering and Environmental Engineering at Virginia Tech. During his time at Virginia Tech, he also was first fellow at BioBuild, which is an interdisciplinary program. And he also had some teaching fellowships. He did a MS in construction management, and he did a bachelor degree in chemical engineering. Without further ado, Ryan, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Marta. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to my talk. It's such a great pleasure. And I mean, it's really a great pleasure because in case you don't know, this is actually the third time I'm trying to give a seminar to this group. I went to San Francisco last year. I tried to go to Berkeley, and then there was a wildfire. So the campus got closed, so I left before. I cannot give a talk. Then this semester, I supposed to go there in March, but because the pandemic of COVID-19, I couldn't. So hopefully third time is the charm, this time virtually. I'm literally knocking on the wood. Hopefully there's no power outage or internet disruption or something. So I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see. Okay. Yeah. So like Marta mentioned, my name is Ryan Wang. I'm an assistant professor at Northeastern University. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about our research on urban mobility and social resilience. In my lab, which is called Urban Informatics and Resiliency Lab, we have quite a few very talented researchers who definitely contributed to the research. I'm going to tell you a little bit more. But in my lab, it's called Urban Informatics. So we actually use different type of so-called big data from urban areas to understand all kinds of social urban phenomena. I'm going to primarily focus on the data, basically the mobility data or the location-based data, either collected from social media or collected from smartphones. We use those type of data to understand human mobility in urban area, in big cities, but primarily into two directions to understand urban resilience. Why I'm talking about resilience, basically, they can mean this two things. One is shocks. So shocks can be natural disasters, terrorist attacks, extreme events, something like pandemics, like COVID-19. The shocks tend to happen really fast and have very significant immediate impact on urban area, on the society, but usually it's also recover relatively fast. I know we have been, cooped up in our house, in our apartment for quite a long time. We don't feel this is short, but there are already uneasiness going on, right? You probably read the news that people are already protesting, they don't want to continue to stay at home anymore. So, like I'm saying, this kind of a shocks usually, have very significant impact, but also recover relatively fast. But then there's also stress that can harm urban resilience. By stress, I mean like racial segregation, social isolation, lack of affordable housing. These are more long-term or chronic issues that you don't see their immediate impact changing our society, changing the urban system that fast. But gradually, if we don't address that, they're going to get worse and worse. And then if at one time passing the tipping point, it actually can, collapse the entire society or even civilization. So those are the two things I'm interested in. The reason I'm really interested in this is also really related to my background. I'm trained as an engineer, as a civil engineer, but I also did my postdoc as a social scientist in sociology. So I'm really interested in how these two systems play together and how one aspect can interact and inform the other. So I'm going to give you two examples, basically tell you a little bit, how I, can't integrate these two together and study them from an integrated perspective. So first one is shocks. I'm going to mainly focus on one example we examined, which is Hurricane Harvey. Hurricane Harvey basically struck Houston area in 2016, and it's caused quite some problem. So it's brought record-breaking rainfall in Houston area, more than 60 inches. It damaged more than 200,000 homes, and then the total damage is over $125 billion. It's a very significant disaster. And from the pictures on the right, you can see that the flood, the extreme precipitation, and the flooding really perturbs the infrastructure and changed the people's behavior and mobility. But that's something I want to, capture and understand a little bit better. So like I said, what I did is that we use the data collected from cell phone. It's called location-based services. So we basically use 60 days data before, during, and after Hurricane Harvey. Each day we get about 500,000 users per day, and about more than 100 million records every day. So those data sets, each entry have the user ID, or actually the device ID, has the latitude, the longitude, and the timestamp, which is in seconds. So basically, based on time, I can connect people's locations and then find out how people move around the city, how their mobility looks like in the city. And we can do a lot of analysis, right? So that's basically what we want to do. We want to use location data, try to understand people's features of their mobility, and then understand how people react, how the disaster, how Hurricane Harvey has changed the people's movements. Before I get into analysis, I always ask them. I'm always asked by one question that, okay, you use this data. This is collected from different services, can be from social media, can be from cell phones, but how representative are they? So to kind of give us a little bit of confidence, we tested the data, we compared data with the data collected from census. So basically what I did is that, like I said, for each individual, we have latitude and longitude. So we can, based on their nighttime location, we can find their homes. And then we join that home with the census block group. So basically how, a small neighborhood defined by US Census. Then we can know, where this person actually living in, which neighborhood this person actually lives in. Then we can basically, get a lot of information about this neighborhood. How many population are there? What are demographic and economic composition of this neighborhood? So here I did a very simple comparison. On the left, this is the distribution, spatial distribution of the population in Houston, in the greater Houston area. This is basically, this is from census data. Then on the right, I basically use the cell phone data to analyze, to find out, how many individuals are living in each neighborhood. So then I did a comparison. The Pearson's R value equals to 0.88. So that's give us some confidence. Please understand that I'm saying it's give us some confidence, but I'm not saying the data is perfect. Just by looking at this, just by visualization, we already see there are some differences, right? And I'm actually going to talk about this a little bit more later about the imperfection of mobility data. But here, we kind of know the high R actually give us some confidence and inform us, certain analysis, we can draw certain conclusion. So with that, then we start to look into the data set. The upper two panel basically compare the mobility or the visitation before Hurricane Harvey and during Hurricane Harvey. You can see that, the darker the color is, the more visitation or the concentration of human mobility. And before, you can see that before Hurricane Harvey, really the downtown area of Houston is kind of like a magnet and attracts a lot of visitations. But then during disaster, it's not so much. The concentration lowered significantly, which makes sense, right? People during this kind of a natural disaster, people want to stay safe. They want to stay at home or want to stay in safe places rather than going around in the heavy rain and heavy wind, right? So that makes sense. Then what we did is that we tried for each individual, we calculate the radius of gyration of this person's mobility. If you're not familiar with that concept, basically we find each individual's home location, then we find out outside the home location, what are the places people visited. And then we calculate the distance. We can roughly think radius as a weighted routine distance for how far people tend to travel on each day. So for all the individuals in this figure, the black line or the dark blue line shows the median value, median mobility radius. Then the dashed line, this two dashed line shows the 50 percentile, and this two dashed line shows the 90 percentile. And you can see that, before this between these two vertical dashed line, that's 1 week when Hurricane Harvey attacked Houston. You can see that before Hurricane Harvey made landfall, the median radius was about 5 kilometers. It definitely shows some periodicity during the weekend. It's drop a little bit and then recover. But when Hurricane Harvey made landfall, or after it made landfall, it's reduced significantly to about 1.5 kilometers and then slowly recovered and roughly went back to normal. And so that's just based on the radius, which we find. And there are multiple ways, different ways to calculate this radius. Some based on just the two most visited locations, some based on the center of mobility instead of home location. We calculated all of them, and they showed a pretty similar trend, pretty similar pattern. Always maintain and show some periodicity, but when Hurricane Harvey made landfall, it dropped and then slowly recovered. So this shows that definitely human mobility was perturbed and then recovered. And this pattern, you probably think this looks familiar, and I think it looks really resemble a very similar pattern from other engineering and ecological systems. When there's an external or external shock or internal failure, the system function drop and then slowly recover back to normal. Right, so we can see this information. So if I may, maybe it shows certain, I think the system shows some uniformity or the universality here. But if we look more closely, the system is also very dynamic and heterogeneous. So this figure, basically we want to understand, we know Hurricane Harvey changed mobility, but how does it change it? And especially we look at, where we lost population and where we gained population. That basically shows evacuation. And in here, you can see the red area are where people evacuated from. So that's dangerous area, people leave. And then the blue area are where people evacuated to. And we also have the arrows to show the flows from, from one area to the other. This system, this makes sense. You can see people, most likely the general trend is that from the area close to the water and moving inland a little bit. We actually plotted this with the casualty data. We find out that there's high correlation between the number of casualty and then the density of people evacuated from. So where people are living, there's a high correlation there. I'm an engineer, so I'm very fascinated to capture this system. We're actually using different models, try to describe what is this, why this system looks like that, and can we, use a model to predict what's going to happen in other scenarios. We are trying the gravity model. We tried the spatial auto-regressive model. We try some models from ecological systems to try to, use models, abstract models to capture this kind of system. But I also, like I said, from a social science perspective, I'm also really interested in what causes this heterogeneity. So my team started to look into what are the difference and how, demographic information or composition can inform the heterogeneity. So we basically break down the neighborhood, break down the population into different neighborhoods. Like I said before, we find each individual home location, we join that with neighborhood, then we know which neighborhood this population are from. Then based on that neighborhood, we know, what kind of a neighborhood this is. Is this majority white? Is this majority Hispanic? Is this majority Black? Is this a majority non-poor or majority poor? And we can see that when we start to look into the, break this down into different neighborhoods, we see a very different story here. For some neighborhoods, the connectivity shows strong concentration. Like, for example, the Black neighborhood. In the broader Houston area, there's African-American population is about 15 to 20% based on different ways to define the greater Houston area. But we see that if one individual is from Black neighborhood, he has a very high chance to end up in another Black neighborhood, to evacuate to another Black neighborhood. The chance is 90%. It shows strong, social segregation even in evacuation, because if there are 20% neighborhood are majority African American and people are randomly walking around neighborhood, they're more likely they should have 20% of chance to end in a Black neighborhood as well. But here we see this number is much higher. We see a similar pattern for Hispanic neighborhood. This trend is lower for the white neighborhood. For poor and non-poor neighborhood, we also see, especially for people from non-poor neighborhood, their evacuation are more likely to be ended up in a non-poor neighborhood as well. So that's the origin and destination for the evacuation patterns. We also look at the evacuation date, the evacuation and return based on the time. So here, 0 means the day Hurricane Harvey made landfall, and then there's 1 day before, 2 days before, then there's 1 day after, 2 days after. And we plot two populations. One is the non-poor population, and the other is the white population. The non-poor population is especially shows a very significant difference. So how we calculated that? So X is evacuation date. The Y is the percentage above baseline. So basically, we're trying to understand if evacuees. So we use the number of evacuees from non-poor neighborhood divided by the non-poor population. So if it's higher, that means this type of population are disproportionate, are higher represented in the evacuees, right? They tend to leave early, and then use that minus 100%. And here we can see that for non-poor population, they are more likely to evacuate early before the disaster made landfall. And then for non-poor population, it's actually 5 days before disaster, it's actually 100% higher than the non-poor the baseline. And we also see this type of inequality in return. Same thing when we observe the non-poor population, we see that they tend to return. So this is the date for population to return back to their home. And we see that people from non-poor neighborhood are likely to return to home relatively early compared to their baseline. You can see non-poor population have a higher percentage to return home and then than other population. So all this result tells us that mobility perturbation mobility population caused by human evacuations has significant social implications. People from vulnerable populations are, less likely to make the wise decision, or a lot of times even have the resources to make decisions. Let's say to evacuate, to have the money or the safe place to evacuate before the disaster made landfall. That's why we see a higher percentage of victims from vulnerable populations. So that's one area, basically, like I said, how to understand when shocks happens, how that impacts the social resilience. And the other research direction is stress. And in this study, I'm going to introduce primarily about the mobility-related isolation. So we basically, social isolation is really important because it undermines the life chances, limited the young people's access to middle-class role models, limited their access to safe environment, and they also have less chance to be able to get the institutional resources. And a lot of times, if they don't have the chance to access to be isolated in their disadvantaged neighborhood, they don't have the lack of job information for adults. But this time, when we talk about social isolation, a lot of times we are thinking where people are living, right? We think white population live inside a white neighborhood and black live in black neighborhood. But there's an implicit assumption that people only interact with other people living inside of the same neighborhood they're living at. But this is not necessarily true. We don't really spend 24/7 at home. Well, maybe now, maybe in recent weeks we do, but usually we don't, right? We go to work, we go to school, we go shopping, we go to public places. Then in order to give us opportunity to interact with other population, right? All those can help us to get all the resources and information we said before. There are some analyses before trying to understand the isolation beyond the residential neighborhoods. There has been experiment studies using surveys or tax records or small-scale data using travel diaries, GPS, and phone apps. But most of the data are small-scale or limited in one city. What we want to examine, more cities, a large-scale study to understand if this is some systematic disadvantage for neighborhood. So basically, the research question we try to understand is that do isolation and the segregation really persist beyond the residential neighborhood? Actually, goes where people are actually travel to. So to answer that question, we use mobility data. In this time, we actually used Twitter data from 2013 to 2015, try to understand, basically try to measure three things. One is radius, we already mentioned before. Basically, you can understand it as the average distance traveled. The spread, which is the number of different neighborhoods people visited. The composition, which is the demographic composition of the neighborhoods people are actually visited. So I'm going to start using Boston as an example. Here in Boston, we collected about 2.34 million geotag tweets. That lasted about 18 months. And then, so we have the entire commuting zone around Boston. And then we analyze all the mobility around this area. The assumption is that people's mobility mostly limited in the broader area. We do a cluster analysis to find out where people's location. In here, each dot, no matter it's red or blue, indicates where people live. But the red dots are actually people who living inside Boston. So we are analyzing the 7,344 people who live inside Boston, although they can travel anywhere, right? So we find that data. So we try to, then we use each individual's Twitter data to understand the three measures we mentioned before. So this short video basically shows what we are trying to do. This is one individual's mobility. You can see he travels, inside and outside Boston. Definitely visit some places more than the others. We see some clusters showing. And then based on the visited places, we find out what neighborhood this person has visited. And by neighborhood, I actually mean the block groups. Then for each neighborhood, we can break into different composition and understand what type of neighborhood he or she has visited. These are the general neighborhood distribution in Boston. So that's basically how we did it. And then, like I said, we first measured the radius, right? We see this is what the radius distribution looks like in Boston. Some people travel, the median is 3.7 kilometer roughly, but the distribution in this case follows roughly a log normal distribution. But when we compare the median, we see that there's not a significant difference here. In fact, people from non-poor or poor Black neighborhood travel a little bit further, not significant, but a little bit further than people from other neighborhoods. We also look at the spread. You can see the variation are pretty similar, but again, the median value is actually a bit higher for people from non-poor and poor Black neighborhood, but roughly they look similar. However, when we start to look at the composition, that's really where we see the difference. Again, by composition, we mean that if this is perfect city, right? There's no isolation, then our movements are kind of like a random walk, right? If there's 50% of neighborhood are white, then when we randomly walk around, we should end up in a 50% chance we should end up in a white neighborhood, no matter which neighborhood you are from, right? No matter which neighborhood you are from. So that's basically what we try to do. We look at the visited non-poor white neighborhoods divided by, we do a composition, we try to find the visited non-poor white neighborhood divided by all the neighborhood we visited, right? If it's random walk, and if this number is, then we minus the baseline. The baseline is, for the commuting zone, Boston commuting zone, 80%, 0.8, 80% of neighborhood are actually non-poor white neighborhood. That means if you randomly walk, it's perfectly random, this number should be 0. This divided by this minus 0.8 should be 0. So we see that's roughly the case for non-poor white, for people from non-poor white neighborhood. It's almost 0, so means that for their visitation, basically they are right at the baseline, right? But if we look at the other race, is very different, especially for poor Black and poor Hispanic neighborhood. Their visitation are significantly below the baseline, significantly below. One is 47% below the baseline, the other is 42%. Another thing, a very striking thing is that when we compare to non-poor Black and poor Black, it doesn't help that much. In Boston, it's actually done to, it's at least based on our analysis, it's your economic status doesn't really help what kind of if you can access the so-called mainstream neighborhood, the non-poor white neighborhood, they basically at the same level. This is what we find to Boston. And then the question is, does the pattern observed here in Boston hold across the 50 most populous cities in other American cities? Maybe this just, Boston is particularly not so great for African-American population. So we did that. We look at the radius, and we find that there are some differences, but generally speaking, the pattern follows log normal distribution. That's for radius. And then when we look at spread, again, the number of visits to neighborhood, we see they are roughly at the same level. Again, people from non-poor and poor Black neighborhood, their spread is actually higher. Here, I break this into two parts. The gray part, the violin chart, the gray part shows the unweighted result, but the blue part shows a weighted result. This is because, come back to the representativeness issue. It's actually really hard to argue that data collected from Twitter are representative enough to inform us. So that's why we used a weighting mechanism. If we get more data from one neighborhood, we give it a higher weight because it's have a higher sample. If it's have a smaller population, then we give it a lower weight, so it shows a lower sample. So it has smaller sample, can introduce more noise. But no matter adding or using the weighting mechanism or not, it shows a very consistent story. Then when we look into the composition, so basically travel to the so-called non-poor white neighborhood, again the mainstream neighborhood, we see the similar inequality across 50 cities. For people from non-poor white neighborhood across 50 cities, they are roughly at or a little bit above the baseline, but for poor population, they are below the baseline. We can see that for poor Black and for poor Hispanic. And then in their case, the economic status doesn't change the pattern that much. We can see that for both of them, their accessibility or their exposure to the non-poor white neighborhood or the disadvantaged neighborhood are significantly lower than people from white neighborhood. So based on this study, it shows that radii are comparable across neighborhood, same for spread, but the residents of poor minority neighborhood are less exposed to the mainstream neighborhood. And that shows despite the increasing diversity, race still matters more than poverty. And the inequality is still a very important and harming factor for our society. So I hope the two cases shows what people at my lab trying to do and what we are interested in. There are some future studies we are trying to pursue, and I would love to get your feedback as well. One thing that we see when Hurricane Harvey happened, the mobility changed significantly. Then it's returned back to normal, right? That make me think, if that's the end of it, right? Because maybe there can be even stronger natural disasters or man-made disasters, or something like COVID-19 can totally change mobility pattern. So in here, this is my hypothesis. We're still working on this, but I'm thinking we're hoping to capture this kind of, use one model to capture this perturbation. So this is a hypothetical universal function that can describe the perturbation. B is stable states for mobility in different urban areas. C is one certain natural disaster happens or man-made disaster happens, how the mobility change, but it may still not very close to the tipping point, so it can recover. But what if some event can push the entire system over the tipping point and actually drop it somewhere here? And that's what we are hoping to observe and hoping to build. The second research we're trying to look at is the unfairness in mobility data. Like I said before, based on our testing and estimation and exploration, there are methods, and the mobility data give us certain confidence that we can answer some questions, but it's by no means means they are perfect. This is we're looking into the cubic data which we use to understand the Hurricane Harvey case, and in this case you can see X is in different weeks. Y is identified residential from mobility data divided by the census data on the block group. When we put in, when we put on the chart, when we calculate R square, this shows pretty high R square. But that doesn't mean it's perfect. You can see consistently across all the week, the percentage of white population for a white neighborhood, if it's have the percentage of population we identified from the cell phone data are much higher. So about 7 to 7.5%, and it's actually changing a little bit. It's actually increased a bit when Hurricane Harvey struck the city. But the representativeness or the percentage of identified population for all the other neighborhoods are much lower. For Black, for Hispanic, for poor neighborhood. This can be very problematic, especially if we want to make decisions based on this data. Think about if based on mobility, we think, well, this neighborhood, even use the data compared to the general population. We thought, well, there's not much activity there. That might means they don't experience much destruction. But it could just because the crowdsourced data we collected itself are not representative enough, and that can really harm the chance for people to survive or stand the one extreme events happens. And we also see that in current pandemic, current COVID-19 situation, we see there are certain neighborhoods hit by the like Milwaukee or like the Chelsea town in Boston. Their population are disproportionately attacked or disrupted or infected by this disaster. So I think we need to understand the unfairness in data better and devise mitigation strategies to make sure we can draw equal and comprehensive conclusions. So that's all the things I want to share with you. So thank you for listening, and now I can answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Questions to the speaker? I have my chat open and the Q&A. While people warm up, because I know it takes time to jump in, I can ask you a question on slide 35.
Sure.
The one you had just right there.
Sorry.
By the way, the idea of the tipping point is very interesting. I wanted to mention that, for example, in New Orleans, people never return to their places, especially the low-income population. So it's true, when the disaster hits so bad, it's really a disruption that they never recovered from. I hope we don't see this in the COVID, but that is a very way to frame that type of situation that had to do with the magnitude of the physical disaster, but also on the economic vulnerability. I love the idea of that plot of tipping points. But then going back to 35.
This one.
The people of transportation, they know very well. This is called expansion factor, and nobody would believe in the transportation literature the phone data as it comes. We always check the ratio between population and users. Right. Then in the cubic data, in Dallas, we did this ratio not in the context of an emergency, and we would put, let's say, in the x-axis, the different groups, income groups, and in the y-axis, the ratio. And I never saw the big difference between 0.04 and 0.07. So what we are saying here, that is from 7 is the way it's plotted, because we're seeing that it's represented from 4 to 7%, almost. I never saw a systematic difference between the income group and the presence and the market share of the data. I wanted to point out the work of Esteban Moro. He did this for same data provider for New York, Chicago, and Boston, I think, and other cities. He did this Y. In the y-axis, you put what the ratio as you have it. Right. And in the x-axis, instead of time, we put the different income groups. And normally it's like a flat curve. I'm surprised to see this different, but I wonder if this has to do with Houston, or that has to do with, this was the week 1 after the disaster. It may be, yes, it may be that it would be very interesting to see that this happened only in the context of a disaster. I encourage you to check the other works that use cubic, Esteban Moro, where they measure this ratio. Right. Not in the disaster context, because I never saw the divide so strong between. Look more strong than 4 and 7 is not too bad. It's only 3%, let's say, but still is considerable, I would say.
I see. I think maybe we want to compare nodes and algorithm and see why I find this disparity. But I agree with you. I think, there are methods to address this. We just want to be really careful, especially in a disaster situation, right? We want to make sure everyone's voice are heard and, equally heard, to make sure we don't mislocate resources. But I mean, I didn't mention this more. I want to hear your opinion. Maybe we can even talk more later. But I'm also, start to getting more and more concerned, not just about representativeness, but also about the quality, quantity and the quality of the data. One thing, we haven't dived very deep into this, but one thing worries me is that during disasters, the precision of the signals from the phone. So
that's a very important thing. That's terrible.
Right. That's actually increasing more than the ones, decreasing more than the ones from advantaged neighborhood. That can introduce a lot of a problem during disasters as well. And I think that's definitely something need to be addressed.
Totally, completely. In Puerto Rico, that was a problem. There was no internet, there was no phone, there was no ATM. It's really terrible.
Yeah.
Totally. Anybody, please, from the audience that would like to ask a question? Or comment. Comments also welcome. I see, great, we have somebody. Scott is here, I think. Yes, cool. Should I read the question or Scott, would you like to make the question with your mic. Laura, how do we handle this? Should I read the question instead? Is that how we do it? Well, in the sake of time, Scott, if you want to jump in and we listen to you, it's wonderful always. If not, let me.
Can you hear me? Am I unmuted?
Scott says, very interesting and timely lecture, looking from data and science toward engineering and policy. I have this question. There he goes. Scott, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, thanks. Great lecture. So I asked, looking from data and science towards engineering and policy specifically, I have this question. If we seek to reduce the inequities that are exacerbated by these shocks, let's say hurricanes, because you presented that, or pandemic, because we experience it today, what would you recommend to governors or mayors of cities to reduce these disparities that are exacerbated by shocks?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the short question is, we need to have a better, how to say that, better toolbox or better approaches to address this. That's actually what we want to do is basically design the algorithms. It can be based on comparison or regression based on the real data, the more representative data, let's say from census, to find the real disparity here. But it can also be based on the more recent research, like the fairness or inclusive algorithms to design these problems, to design these tools to address this, basically to augment the data or augment the representative of the data. But I mean, when it's come to informing the decision making or the policy, it's hard to say, to be honest. We actually, like Marta introduced, I'm part of the BORI, and we work closely with, relatively close with the cities, but they want simple, direct measures or simple, direct answers rather than all the sophisticated methodology. So from that perspective, it's really hard to say from what message, what kind of information we can present to the government or to the decision makers to make it more effective. I think my interest is just more about from a scientific or methodological perspective, address this and make it more aligned to really what the population looks like, the representative population looks like.
Thank you. Anybody else? Welcome to bring a comment or a question in this panel. We have more shy panelists than in person. I can continue the discussion to type of follow-up on Scott's question about I know, just bringing the fairness of the data is one task. I think the elephant in this room, any ideas or anything we can talk about the current contingency, the role of civil and environmental engineering and transportation in the light of COVID, anything that you want to share with us? COVID-19.
We are doing a few research, and we're actually, one thing, we actually start to talk with program manager at NSF, not a program manager, I think a science advisor at National Science Foundation. One thing they are very interested, and I think maybe many people here can help contribute, is that, what we're going to do with the stay-at-home orders. When can we start to lift it, so the economy can recover? If we do want to start to lift it, what kind of strategy can we use? Which will be the best strategy? One thing they are very interested in, especially, can we do a stepwise lift of the stay-at-home order, so people, maybe they can go back to work if that's not so risky, but they don't still limit their other activities, such as entertainment or leisure, or those kind of activity. And also they want to make sure that we not only recover the economy, but also meet or don't overburden the healthcare systems, to make sure that even when we lift the order, more people and new patients can get infected, but still within the capacity of the healthcare systems. I think that's there's a lot of things the civil engineers and the environmental engineers can do to help address that question.
It's wonderful, because that's a paradigm of demand management. We have been trained for that so much about the traffic, but now everybody's listening. And it's not only the use of routes, it's the use of your everyday needs, your demands in all senses.
Totally.
And you're right. I think CE has been absolutely trained for that. Mm-hmm. And we need never, in this context, we never imagined we would be doing this.
Yeah.
But I believe it's a demand management problem. Knowing the everyday mobility of the city, taking into account that we are not going to take the data as it comes, we need to be sure the expansion factor. So who is represented and who is not.
Totally.
So it's from users to totals to have a model of demand, and then manage it that we feel get our needs covered, but in a almost centralized way, like we're doing now. Now the centralized way is every day we go at the same time and get stuck in traffic, and now we're all stopped and we cannot leave.
Right.
It's the stream solutions. I think information technologies can hopefully help a little bit better.
Totally. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Thank you. Yeah. And in Boston, there are multiple research going on, but in Boston, they're also exploring what are the best strategy to continue to have the public transit running, but still allow people to maintain social distancing. The MBTA, which is the organization running the public transit, after the governor issued a stay-at-home order, they significantly limited their capacity, their trains. But then people find out, well, there are people still need to go to work, and they are actually crowded in the cars. After they complain, this MBTA resumed more of the functions, provided more trains. So I think that's those kind of adaptation, those kind of decision making is very interesting in this time as well.
Yes. Another aspect of multi-city is that how different countries and cities are managing the situation, and it has to do with different even willingness. I was seeing some videos from Kentucky that they want to go back to work. There were protests in front of the governor's house, while on the other hand, in the Bronx, it's dramatic, the videos that they are. So it's like, even if we are one country, we have so many different complicated factors. So it's like one solution doesn't fit it all. This is something that must be organized regionally as a distribution of the health resources, because it has to do a lot with people would not take what we say, well, in emergency, yes, but in the going back to normal, we need to adapt.
That's true.
To the different conditions. They are rural areas, they are super dense areas like Chicago, New York. So it's a whole, it is a challenge. It is a fascinating challenge. It has been so good to have you. So how many events happened? It was a fire, you could not talk. It was a post, another cancellation, and we could not have been a more good timing. I need to say something that Amanda is telling us. We will have a break next week from the seminar. Please attend the aviation data seminar that happened on Wednesday. That could be our equivalent. And keep in mind, as a tradition, we're going to have all the doctoral students presenting their work. And I think that is happening next Friday, but I'm sure Amanda will send a confirmation email. So we keep all the activities in the ITS despite the distance, and that opportunity in which the doctoral students present their work is almost like the highlight, one of the highlight activities of the ITS. Then keep tuned for next Friday. As for seminar, we invite you to go to the Wednesday seminar of the Aviation Data Science Seminar, and keep tuned for the presentation of our graduating doctoral students. And because I don't see any hands, I think if there is anybody that wants to ask a question and I don't see it, please unmute and jump in. But if not, I think I can let the room go, thanking the speaker again with a virtual applause.
Thank you very much. It's such
and
thank you.
Thanking everybody for joining us.
Yeah.
This